I'm DC.
And I'm Michael.
And you're listening to the Monster Guys podcast. You don't believe in me? Observed the ghost. I don't, said Scrooge. What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses? I don't know, said Scrooge. Why do you doubt your senses? Because, said Scrooge, a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. Welcome to the Monster Guys podcast. Michael, tonight we take a little bit of a step toward a lighter subject in some regards. We're going to be breaking down A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I almost said by Ebenezer Scrooge, but he is the central figure of the story by Charles Dickens. And I guess we're going to approach it from a little bit different perspective. We're going to be talking primarily about what most people consider to be the ghosts in the story. We're gonna kind of tackle them as they really are and what they represent in the larger picture, and it's going to be a little bit of a fun departure from our normal chats. At the same time, we're still going to dig deeply into the folklore of this story and pull out some interesting things from Charles Dickens' classic favorite story and see what these ghosts have to tell us.
It's interesting that you say a lighter topic. In some regards, as you said, it's also a very dark topic at times. So that's actually a theme that we'll be playing with light and dark in this episode.
It is. Now, before we get too deep into this topic tonight, I think a congratulations are in order. We announced it last week officially through a press release, but Michael, you're now part of the writing team for Ballistic Interactive. And many people who've been with us for a while may remember that we interviewed the guys from Ballistic Interactive. They're an independent game development company out of Australia, currently developing what I would call a brilliant and stunning video game called Hellhunter. And if you've seen any of this game or followed it for any amount of time, you know what I'm talking about. This is just a beautiful game that they're developing. We've been on and off chatting with these guys for the past year. We interviewed them, I believe, last November or last December on the podcast, but you are now writing for that video game. So congratulations to you.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it. I have been looking forward to the game just for the sake of playing it. It touches on a lot of topics that I love. The first, of course, being monsters and folklore. They have an interesting approach to that, and I'm excited to be behind the scenes a little bit before this game is released. And I can't wait to get my hands on it to play the thing, so taking part in making it is a big opportunity, and I'm very excited, and I'm just glad to be on the team with Kai and Sky King.
Again, if you've been following it through us at all, then you'll remember them talking about this in the interview and us mentioning it a few times this year, but our episode on the Wendigo was an inspiration for the development of some of the creatures in that game, which, of course, we were very proud to be a part of that inspiration. Had no idea until they called us and said, hey, that episode, so it was very exciting to be a part of it at that level back then, and now seeing you part of the team is just amazing. So congratulations all the way around. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Hellhunter will be available sometime in 2018. Again, if I'm not mistaken, you can go right now to Steam and put it on your wish list and kind of get some insight and more details about the game. So they've come a long way, and they've got a lot of attention around the globe, and very exciting to see where this game goes.
Yeah, if you haven't watched the trailers for it or seen anything about it yet, I'd recommend going to Steam or go look it up on their website. It is still, I believe, the freshest thing I've seen on Steam in quite a while.
Yeah, it's very exciting. We did a press release, and if you go to themonsterguys.com, I think just a couple of posts back, you can find that press release and their links to go visit the site, see the trailers and all the details, and just kind of take you on a small web through their world to find out more. And I would certainly encourage you to do that, especially if you're a gamer. If you are a gamer, this is something definitely you want to put your hands on.
So many aspects I can't talk about.
I know. Top secret stuff, but nonetheless. Well, folks, we are into December. Can you believe that it is already December 2017? This year, it just seems to be a blink in my mind. Even though we've seen so much happen in our world, in the world at large, 2017 is almost over. What do we do with ourselves for the next few days, Michael?
Sleep.
I
wish.
We're going to sleep the rest of December.
I wish. Going right out of the Halloween season into the rest of the holiday season, we've both been very busy for different reasons and similar reasons, and I feel like we're going to continue to be that for some exciting causes as well. So
yeah, so
hopefully some sleep in there.
Yeah, definitely. We are into December, so I think tonight's chat is an appropriate topic for the season. Let's break down A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Now, before anybody says, oh my gosh, they're going to talk about this book from 1843. No, it's pretty deep. Even though it's a smaller book and there's an obvious layer of the moral of the story, so to speak, written into this, there's a lot more to this story than meets the eye, and certainly when you approach it from the standpoint of the lore of the central characters of the ghosts. And that's what most people would refer to them as, is ghosts. Even Dickens himself referred to it as a ghost story. And there are reasons why it's referred to as a ghost story, but I think it's even more than that. And so let's break that down. Start us out. What is this story about? Bird's eye view. Just in case anybody that's listening maybe hasn't read this or hasn't read it in a long time, where do we start? First of all, before you do that, Michael, I'm gonna interrupt you before you even start talking. Did you know, this is an interesting point in the history of all this, but did you know that it is believed by some, or it is proposed by some, that Charles Dickens' ghost possibly haunts the Omni Parker House Hotel in Boston?
I did not.
Okay.
Boston?
In Boston. Well, okay. You know that he wrote this in London in 1843. It became popular there. It became popular later in America. So 1860s, he comes over to America for a reading tour. This is back when authors actually did reading tours and cool things like that. As a matter of fact, he's described by people who have watched him or who had seen him do his readings that he would not just simply read a story, but he was very animated. He would pace the stage. He would act out the characters in different voices and different mannerisms. It was draining for him to do a reading because he was so theatrical. He's described as a one-man Broadway, one-act show reading this book for people. But in the 1860s, he came to America to do a reading tour, but he kind of made his headquarters the Parker House Hotel in Boston. He loved it there, and he stayed there when he went. The first time he ever did this reading publicly was for the Saturday Club, which was a literary club whose members included, get this, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Louis Agassiz. Talk about a who's who of your literary club. So he does this for these guys, but then he goes on this reading tour, and towards the end of the 1860s, I think it's 1868, he's ending his tour, and he wants to come back to Boston for a last time visit because he loved it so much, and this tour took its toll on him because just a couple of years later, he dies. I think he was in, late 50s when he died?
Yeah, he wasn't very old.
Yeah, he was very young. So he dies not too long after that. So some people propose that Dickens' ghost has revisited that hotel. There are 3 floors apparently to the hotel, and it's said that at times the elevator will on its own and randomly go to the 3rd floor.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Now, apparently there's another famous actress from the same time period who was a fan of Dickens, and when she would go to the hotel, she would stay in Dickens' suite. It's also proposed by some that perhaps her ghost is revisiting the Dickens suite because she wants to go back and visit Charles Dickens. So, I don't know. Is Dickens haunting a hotel in Boston? Is it the actress fan of Dickens? I don't know.
You know, when you think of Dickens, what stories do you think of other than A Christmas Carol?
A Tale of Two Cities?
Yeah.
Hard Times?
A lot of people, I didn't realize until recently just how many ghost stories he wrote. He wrote quite a few.
He was fascinated with ghosts.
And he inspired quite a few other writers that would later on define the horror genre, including people like Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe. So I think it's only appropriate that he would haunt someplace like that later on in life.
Yeah, apparently he was obsessed with ghosts at a certain level. He said this. He said, ideas, like ghosts, according to the common notion of ghosts, must be spoken to a little before they will explain themselves. Charles Dickens. His friend and biographer, John Forster, also said of him that he had something of a hankering after ghosts. He said, as such, Dickens' obsession with the supernatural, he was convinced that he would, quote, have fallen into the follies of spiritualism had it not been for, quote, the strong retraining power of his common sense. So Dickens had this balance where he was fascinated and obsessed with the supernatural and with ghosts, but he also had this really strong internal clock, if you will, that would turn back to the common sense side of his brain and keep him in check. And it was quite a note of his life, of just how steeped in the supernatural he was and how much fun he had with that. But a lot of his stories are ghost stories.
And one of the ones that I haven't had a chance to read yet, but I'd like to soon, especially after researching this discussion, I guess the story To Be Read at Dusk itself questions the nature of ghosts.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a central point as well for what we will be talking about tonight. What exactly is a ghost?
Yeah, let's talk about this. A Christmas Carol. Here's another point of interest about this story. Did you know that the term Merry Christmas was actually coined and made popular by this novel?
There are some people that believe that Charles Dickens saved Christmas because of this novel.
There are a lot, and it's got some foundation to that, because at the time, and especially in his region of the world, Christmas was pretty much done. It was banned. It was not being practiced. And a lot of people believe, because of his nostalgia and his cautionary tale here with the Christmas Carol, that it was brought back into revival.
Well, I'd like to point out this, and a lot of people see the Christmas Carol as a cautionary tale, but it's somewhat of a cautionary tale, but it is also something of a commentary on the time about how people are getting rid of Christmas and what it might do to the world. So it has that cautionary feel to it, but it's also almost a love letter to Christmas.
Yeah.
And what it can be.
I would agree. And the book is written in 5 parts, essentially 5 chapters of the book, but they're called staves. This is an interesting piece of information about the story as well that some may or may not know about, but a stave is like the musical staff. If you look at the music staff, when you're reading music, it has, if you're just looking at it, it's got like the 5 lines that go up and down that make up that staff. And that's a very technical term. 5 lines that go up and down.
I was going to say.
Yeah. So that's called a stave. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from top to bottom, those lines that vary the pitches, or, you have your notes laid out on a musical staff. So he terms his chapters as staves. Stave 1, stave 2, stave 3, stave 4, stave 5. And it's meant to denote, pun intended, it's meant to denote that the story is like a song.
Yeah, and the title of the story itself, not just A Christmas Carol, but the full title, A Christmas Carol, in prose, being a ghost story of Christmas, I think points back to that as well.
Yeah, I gotta love those long titles.
They were popular back in that age.
I think they're becoming popular again, and for good reason.
Yeah. I would agree with that, and I think part of the reason he did that, again, is to question the traditions of Christmas and what they were losing at that time. Christmas carols were one of the things that were starting to die out, and he really didn't want that to happen.
So let's start with stave 1, which is Marley's ghost. We know that Marley was a previous business partner who had passed, and in this story now has revisited Scrooge. Let's start with that, because I think, to be honest with you, and you pointed this out to me earlier in our discussion, that all the other ghosts, quote unquote, in the story are not really what we would think of as ghosts, rather more as spirits or spirit guides. We'll get into that a little bit later, but Marley, his character here, is really the one that's more like a ghost.
He is. And it's interesting, most of the time when you think of a ghost these days, you might think of either poltergeist or this floating orb of light or this fragment of energy, of psychic energy that haunts a castle. Or you might think of stories like the cars that drive, the phantom cars that drive off the highway the same time every night, recreating the scene of that person's death every single night, looping this existence. Or you might think of somebody who's died with a mission or an objective that has not been complete, so they come back to complete that. Marley is the closest thing, like you said, to a ghost in the story, and yet he is still very different. He wanders the earth like ghosts do sometimes, but
Right.
he is surrounded and completely consumed by these chains and padlocks. It talks about how he even has deeds and ledgers and money boxes attached to these chains. And he is basically living the afterlife as he lived his life. He's created all of these things in the course of his greedy life, and now he's weighed down by it in the afterlife, and he is going place to place. And he specifically laments the fact that he did have all of this wealth. Now that he's dead, he can go see person to person and realize that people are in a poor state. They are financially destitute and they are failing as human beings and they need help. And he wants to help them now, but he's dead and he obviously cannot. So he's talking about these chains that he has and how long they are. And he warns his friend in life, Scrooge, that Scrooge's chains are as long now before he's died as Marley's are in death. So he's saying, you're going to be worse off than I am if you don't change your ways.
Yeah, so Jacob Marley comes back and visits Scrooge this night and essentially gives him a picture of what's coming. He doesn't even need the three spirits to visit him later. Marley is giving him the picture in full and saying, listen, this is what we're about. Change your ways. But at that point, Scrooge doesn't see it. And so Marley says to him that three spirits are going to visit him that night and give him some significant vision. And at that point, Scrooge falls asleep.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you had quoted a passage from the book earlier about how Scrooge doesn't believe in Marley. Even though he sees him, Scrooge is very skeptical about his existence or the fact that he's being visited by a ghost. He's almost of a scientific mind saying, you might just be a piece of cheese or something, I think is one of the movies with Jim Carrey. I think that was his line, which was pretty funny. But even in the novella, Scrooge is very skeptical of him. And Marley responds to this by tormenting him. He starts tormenting him before this even. That famous scene of his face being a doorknob or a knocker on the door is in the novella. And I think it shows Charles Dickens' creative license and his fantastic mind, which is awesome to this day. But it also displays kind of a poltergeist to nature. And I want to go back to the root of ghost. It actually comes from an old English and old German word that also meant fury. Mm-hmm. So if you think of ghosts as these furious creatures, which makes a lot of sense in a lot of ghost stories. They're angry that they're, in the afterlife. Marley is angry, at his state of existence and the possible state of existence that his friend might come to. So he is the penultimate ghost in this story. Moving on from him, though, he talks about how he's arranged for 3 other visitors to come see him that night.
Yeah, before you get to him, though, I think as well, in this interaction between Scrooge and Jacob Marley's ghost, I think we have a bit of a picture of Charles Dickens himself. It's the whole fascination with the supernatural versus you're just a piece of cheese. That common sense thing that I see you, but I don't believe in you. It's that struggle between the physical and the spiritual, or some might say the material versus the immaterial. But I think you see that struggle. I think Charles Dickens is giving us a picture of himself a little bit at a time in this story as well.
He does that with, I think, 3 characters in particular. He does that a little bit with Marley and Scrooge, but he does so more in just Scrooge alone because Charles Dickens actually went through a lot of financial issues. As a child, he actually belonged to a fairly wealthy family, a family that was getting along well enough. until his father fell into some financial trouble and was actually put into prison for not being able to pay his debts. Charles Dickens, as a boy, was forced to give away his collection of books and all of his toys and everything. Apparently, he had a pretty nice collection of books. And he was sent to work in I believe it was a stoneworking factory or working mill. So you see that Charles Dickens knew both sides of the fence back then. He knew what it was like to be in a good situation, and then he knew what it was like to be in a bad situation, this rat-infested factory.
Yeah, and he wrote of that quite a bit
Yep.
Throughout his works, especially read Hard Times, and you see it's a full-face commentary of the times in which he lived.
So this gave him not only an understanding of both sides, he understood what the poor were going through, and he also understood what people in wealth were going through. So you see that worry about money in the future in Scrooge as the story goes on. And then I think you also see a little bit of him in Tiny Tim, this kid who's trying to get along well and wants to look at the bright side of the world, but he's not in a good place, and he's probably going to die soon.
Let me tell you, folks, Charles Dickens is a brilliant mind. A brilliant mind and just an amazing storyteller. So let's go then to The Ghost of Christmas Past, because that's the first one that shows up. And along the way, we've got to talk about this difference between the concept of ghost and spirit and why we feel like there's a deeper level to these three visitors than what's on the surface is just a ghost story.
Well, I think the first thing would be that he does not look human. I mean, he kind of looks human, and a lot of our interpretations of this story throughout the years, mostly in film, depict him as somewhat human. However, he is something of a candle. And I think you see this again in the Jim Carrey version. You actually see this candle-like figure. But even in the novella, he is a bright, androgynous being of sorts with a very bright face that's said to produce this jet of white light. And he carries around with him a cap for snuffing out candles.
Yeah, and strangely childlike.
Yes.
But with features of an old man.
Yep. His hair is said to be white as if from age. So you have somebody who is of an indeterminate age and appearance that takes Scrooge through the past. And I think the idea that comes out to me immediately is that he is this light that sheds light on the past. The idea of this guy carrying around something you might snuff a candle out with. He describes the limbs as being undefined at times, where you might see one limb or two limbs, or you might see 20 limbs, but the edges are never seen, kind of like a candle flame.
Yeah, but I think he's more than just a light that illuminates the past. I believe he's a light that represents the greatest part of our human potential, if you will, the light in the world. And its ability, or it's not necessarily its ability, but its capacity to be snuffed out by something. This cap that snuffs out the candle flame, the lust and the greed and the stinginess of Scrooge having the capacity to snuff out that light in the world. Looking at Christmas past, what do we think about when we look backward? Oh, the good old days, the way it used to be. Those warm, fuzzy moments that we always feel when we think about times past. No matter how hard it was, we can always look back and say, man, those were some good times.
I think that's an important thing to note here as well. We've talked about how, Christmas was going away at this point. Christmas was fading away. If you think about it being, as you said, the good old days, the light that you can go back to. Charles Dickens was fascinated with Christmas as well as with ghosts. He loved it, and he saw the good it could bring for people. Back in the 17th century, I believe, Father Christmas was known as being the bringer of the feast, the custodian of good times and festivities. People danced and sang and listened to music. They were excited. They were feasting during this time period.
A wassailing.
Yeah, yes.
We talked about that last year. We need to make some more wassail this year. We have the recipe in the kitchen.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one.
Yes.
But it was a big deal back then, and it started to fade away. And I think you see this represented in the fact that Scrooge, as a boy, wanted to participate, but he was more focused on the future. He was afraid of how things would turn out, so he turned more inward. But there was a magic in his childhood that he did love and did want to be a part of these things.
Well, and I think another interesting point about this particular spirit, if you look at its features, its characteristics, that childlike face, the hair of like an old man, the light emanating from its face. What does that remind you of?
I don't know if I know what you're talking about. I don't know if we've referenced it on the podcast before.
I don't think we have, because last year we were going to do this big episode on Santa Claus and reconstruct Santa from its historical roots. And we didn't do that because it was so much information that we actually felt like we were giving a lecture. So we actually recorded the episode but never released it. But part of the Santa Claus history, now get away from the red Coca-Cola drinking fat man of the 1930s in the U.S., and I want you to go back further. Part of the makeup of the Santa, if you will, the Santa character was the Christkindl. And we're going back to Germany and some of the European countries now, but the Christkindl was that representation of light and a bringer of gifts into the world. And of course, we have the representation of that in certain religions, such as the Christian religion with the Christ child. But there's a piece of that in this character here, in this spirit in Charles Dickens' story that says Christmas is a time of light. It's a time of bringing gifts. It's a time of good. It's a time of helping the poor, of serving the needy, not ourselves, which is what the Christkindl represented in history, which helped to create the whole character of Santa Claus.
Another point to consider, though, is the physical appearance of the Christkind or the Christkindl. It's very odd. When you were first telling me about it last year, it was bizarre, to be honest. It has a function very similar to Santa Claus coming into the house. I think they left wine for this instead of milk and cookies, but they would leave a gift of wine out for it.
I want to be that Santa Claus.
Yeah, but it came in and it would, give gifts, and then it would leave, and people knew it was gone from the house when they heard the sound of a bell, which almost sounds like the idea of the Holy of Holies in Israel.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting appearance that it was described to have.
Let's flip the script on that one. Interestingly enough, it's also representative of a spirit being gone. If you look in certain practices of cleansing a house, ringing the bells will cleanse the house of a spirit, according to some people. And that's a very one-layered, top-layer description of that, but there's a lot more to that. But ringing the bells or the chimes can help to cleanse an area.
It's funny that you say that. When in the beginning of the story, Marley comes in, he's almost announced by the ringing of a bell in the book as well. Mm-hmm. Almost, I wonder if he did that on purpose as this is almost an exorcism of Scrooge's
it is.
darker side of humanity.
So we have this ghost of Christmas past, or this spirit of Christmas past, that is saying that there is a brighter point in history to look back to, but also there's a brighter point in our potential as humanity to look forward to. Hey, Scrooge, do you get it yet?
And don't forget, I wanted to bring this up about the Christkindl as well. That being is described as being an almost androgynous, childlike being of sorts, almost like a ghost or a spirit itself, and having a very bright face. Mm-hmm. Almost described sometimes as being this fairy-like child.
Yeah.
And I think it lines up with this ghost of Christmas past. And I have to wonder, I've never seen it confirmed that, this is what he based it off of, but it makes too much sense, especially when the other two ghosts of Christmas present and Christmas yet to come both have this other archetype that they line up with as well.
So the point of this, beyond looking backward and looking ahead to what could be, it also spoke to Scrooge that, because the spirit took him back to revisit his childhood days, revisit his apprenticeship, and revisit his engagement to Belle, and reminded him your lust for money and your greed lost you these things. So in the midst of all of this, if you're not careful, for all that there is to gain, here's all that you could lose. And then we move forward to the ghost or the spirit of Christmas present, which is another whole ball of wax to itself. Here's this enormous figure, this giant that's clad in a green fur-lined robe, and he takes Scrooge on a journey altogether different.
Yeah. He is the image of Father Christmas and as well Father Time.
Yeah, and I likened him earlier to the Holly King.
Yes.
From Celtic religions. Celtic legend. I don't want to say religions because it's not always religion for some people, but...
Yes, and he carries a cornucopia. He has a holly wreath upon his head, kind of further likening him to that Holly King, which, interestingly enough, is always the strongest in winter. He is out of the Oak King and the Holly King, he is the one that presides over that time of year.
Yeah, the Oak King is strongest in the opposite end of the year, summertime, and the Holly King in the winter.
So you go back again to...
I say that, Michael, because you throw those terms around like everybody's just supposed to read your mind.
Sorry. You go back to this figure who has been around for a very long time. Father Christmas has been around in England for a long time. And going back to the 17th century, again, he was the custodian of the feast. He was the big personification of that festival for people.
The jolly old Saint Nick.
Yeah. Actually, he becomes a huge piece of St. Nicholas later on. So you have this bigger-than-life, literally bigger-than-life figure that appears to Scrooge. And I think a point you had talked about was that his lust for money and his greed is part of what ruined his opportunities for him. I think it's important to note as well, those developed over time, his twisted greed and his twisted hoarding of riches and wealth. But originally, he was just concerned for the future. And his concern for that future actually robbed him of the future that he originally wanted.
Yeah, if you're always looking to the future, you're never present.
And he forgot the past as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important part of the first two ghosts. In the first ghost, the ghost of Christmas past, he's looking back and remembering the magic that once was. Whereas the ghost of Christmas present is reminding him that he's always holed up in his house and he's never looking out to everybody else. He's never sharing it with anybody. So you see him go and take Scrooge to the parties and the festivities that are happening in that day and age. And then you see, of course, the flip side of him taking Scrooge to the less fortunate and seeing Tiny Tim's plight in life and how he's going to probably die soon. And there's an important part to note here. Part of the reason Charles Dickens wrote this story was not just to remind people of Christmas and to pay attention to what was being lost and what could potentially save them in the future, but it was also written primarily in mind with children of the time and day. People in that time, they were going through the Industrial Revolution, so people were experiencing great wealth, people were experiencing riches and new luxuries, but they were kind of lost in that life as well. There was a lot that was to be gained, but there was a lot that people were not really getting. On the other side of the coin, though, it was interesting. I think he was inspired to write this story, according to one of his letters, based on a report of the time talking about how kids of that day and age that were working in the factories and living on the streets were becoming ignorant because they were losing out on education. So as a boy growing up who had experienced good wealth and then been forced to go work in this rat-infested factory, he had a passion for kids growing up, and he wanted to know that they had a chance for education and a chance for their own future. So this was a very important part to him.
Yeah, in this particular portion of the story, we see this spirit, the ghost of Christmas present, has two starving children, or starved children, tucked away in his coat. Their names were Ignorance and Want. And those are the characters that you're talking about, and the representation of the times, if you will, that were inspiring Dickens. One of the questions I had asked earlier in our discussion together was, why the Holly King? Why Father Christmas? Why Father Time for this portion of the story? It just seems almost counterintuitive.
To go to the past.
Huh?
To go to the past, you mean?
Well, yeah, but just looking at, Christmas present, why that big, strong, jovial, wealthy figure? And you had pointed out, I think you just alluded to it here just a minute ago, but on the top end of things, everything was a feast. People were wealthy. It was a big time, but underneath it all, there was a lot of poverty. Education was lacking, a lot of hard times for people in different parts of life. So there was a great representation in that same person of both ways.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that, being hidden away in his cloak, unseen.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And I think we talk about the four spirits, the four ghosts here, but I think those were as well their own little spirits or their own ghosts representing these two things. And the ghost of Christmas present does say, beware of this one, talking about ignorance. He says, of the two, beware of him the most, for he, is the more dangerous of the two.
Yeah, and honestly, let's look at today. This is still relevant for today. What are we struggling with in our world today? Poverty, lack of education, lack of resource for a lot of children, a lot of families around the world. Even in the wealthiest of nations, we have this massive gulf between, it's the subject of everything today, this massive gulf between the ultra wealthy and the ultra poor, and how the middle of that is disappearing. I believe it's disappearing because of ignorance, a lack of education. Now, there are those of us who are fighting to keep that education in place and, lend a hand to one group and pointing a finger to another, if you will, but it's a similar case study for today. And I believe the story has a great deal of relevance to our own society today around the world. So maybe we need to be listening to the Christmas present spirit.
I think something hopeful is that of all of the different movie adaptions of older literature, of all of the different things that have reoccurred in our world as far as stories go, this is something that has been retold again and again and again.
Charles Dickens haunts us every year with as many new revisions of the story in various media that come out.
So you're saying that so the ghost of Charles Dickens does not haunt Boston, he haunts the entire world.
He haunts every one of us.
I think I'm okay with that.
I think even people who don't realize how much impact Charles Dickens and his stories have had on us are living the impact of Charles Dickens' stories upon their lives.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
So you have the ghost of Christmas present, this very healthy implication of Father Christmas, and as well, like we said before, Father Time, because as we see throughout the day, he grows older and older. And Scrooge even asks, are you getting older as I look at you?
Yeah.
And by the end of their visit together, by the end of that specific Christmas day, he has grown old and weary and tired.
Yeah, Scrooge had asked him to remain for that party, the feast, and he grew old. Let's move on to Stave 4, or Chapter 4. This is the one that a lot of people think is the really spooky part of the story, and I'm not sure I agree with that, but the ghost of Christmas yet to come.
Well, it is spooky, especially considering what it represents, the future.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is a lot of people look at that and think Grim Reaper.
Oh, yeah.
And a Reaper of sorts, but I'm not sure that's the Grim Reaper.
So we have a Christkind, possibly. Maybe that's what that was based off of or alluding to. And then we have Father Time. And then we have what a lot of people do look at and see as the Grim Reaper, this character in a muffled black cloak. And he never shows anything except for a single white pale hand. A trembling hand at times. And I think one passage in the book even says that Scrooge was thrilled, and thrilled not as in excited and happy, but thrilled as in he felt that feeling of the fear running up his spine. He felt the trepidation, knowing that there were eyes behind that darkness of the cloak out looking at him. And the ghost of Christmas yet to come is spooky because he's silent. The other two so far, Marley being the first, actually, the other three, I should say, they each have their own personalities. Marley is very warning, very agonized and angry and furious, like we talked about with ghosts before. But he's still warning Scrooge. We see Scrooge as this mean old man, but Scrooge praises Marley for being a friend to him in his life. And these two were actually good friends. Mm-hmm. They probably hated each other like everybody else at some points, but these two were the only friends to each other in the whole world, probably. And then you move on to the first ghost of Christmas, and that character is very ambiguous, very subtle, but he is very kind still, showing Scrooge some of his fondest memories as a child. And of course, then you have the holly jolly giant in the next act. And now you have this ghost that doesn't speak at all. It's very off-putting for Scrooge. He goes to this next ghost almost looking forward to this new lesson that he's going to learn based on everything else that's happened that night. And instead, he's met with a wall of silence and fear.
Darkness and silence and fear.
And instead of seeing the magic or the present festivities, now he's taken to an image of people looting at the house of a dead man. And he doesn't know it's his own house yet, but he does recognize these bed sheets look familiar. This person used to work for me. So it's starting to form this darkness in Scrooge's idea of the future, which I think is, again, Charles Dickens saying, look at what is ahead if we let this die off. He's very good at showing this character progression in Scrooge, but he's also talking about the world at large. We're going to let Christmas die off and look at what we have to look forward to. Nothing but darkness and despair and death, basically. The death of society. And that may seem a bit extreme, but again, with what he was looking at the ideas and the joy that Christmas could bring, the kind warm-heartedness that it could offer to people, and then the education of children dying away. He was probably thinking of a very extreme world.
Yeah, and again, the relevance to today. Look at our world without the right spirit in our own hearts guiding us. Listen, folks, I'm all for Halloween, but in the darkness, we still must find the light. We've got to look around us and realize that there are kids who are losing out on education. There are families who are starving to death. There is a lot around us that still needs help. And if we allow that world to go without intervening, without taking action, without being a light in the darkness, if you will, for some of those situations, even if it's for a single person, imagine what the world looks like without that. So we still have a relevance today to a story that was written in the mid-1800s.
Yeah. And I like the fact that Scrooge, in the first half of the book, maybe the first half of the novella, he is this curmudgeonly, grumpy old person that doesn't want anything to do with anybody. And we see him now in this last act. We see him shocked at what this last ghost is showing him and the fact that there's no compassion for this guy. And he says, show me some hint of emotion over this man's passing. And all he gets is a scene of people celebrating his passing.
Yeah.
Again, he doesn't know it's him yet, but he feels great sadness for whoever it was that died. And so next he asks for fond memories, for love and compassion, not just this bitter enjoyment of somebody's death. And he's taken to the death of Tiny Tim as his family mourns over Tiny Tim. And so again, it's just a reminder to him that there's nothing good here. There's nothing nice in this future, this bleak future. Even the kinder people, they're not celebrating the death of somebody, they're mourning what was lost. And so finally, as the story goes, he goes to the graveyard and it's revealed to him that he was the one that died. And I think it's a revelation. If you want to take it as a metaphor for the culture and society of the time, I think it's a revelation that if you don't save Christmas, if you don't save the things that Christmas is about, the kind-heartedness, the appreciation for one another, the education of each other, you're going to look back and realize that you died. And you let everybody else die with you. You let culture die with you. Another interesting point, though, in that graveyard scene is very small and subtle, I think, and it's hard to read in our current cultural context because you read about the hand of the specter trembling. The specter has been very quiet and very still, almost starkly so. It talks about how at certain questions, the spirit would only point with that spectral hand, but it was stock still. And when Scrooge finally learns that he was the one that died, he starts to regret and feel remorse for the things that he could have changed, and he starts asking the specter, can I change? Can I still save myself? Can I still help the world? And it talks about the specter's hand trembling. And in that time, in the way Charles Dickens described it, it came off as being kind. So once again, you have the kindness of these three spirits that have visited him this night after Marley. And it's a good reminder that they were there to help him all along.
Yeah, you don't really have a reaper in this, truly. You have more of a deliverer of a vision of what's coming, which in the case of Scrooge and in the case of many of our own lives, we need to have a vision, and that vision would save us, save us from ourselves, if you will.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. You're right. The three spirits come forth in kindness, as dark as it seems, and gives us this message. And of course, Scrooge goes through all of the emotions, from that old curmudgeon through the elation of what could be to, oh my gosh, this is what's coming.
And regret.
And the regret. And then back to, a sense of joy because when he wakes up for real, it's like, oh, wow, I've got a second chance.
Stave 5, everybody's alive.
Yeah.
He can go save Tiny Tim, and the story's over. End of podcast.
Right.
But no, he definitely wakes up, and because of Marley's intervention, and it's interesting to note, Marley actually arranged for those three spirits to come. So I have to wonder, he's toiling away in the afterlife, wandering the earth. Does he have business cards for these guys? Or how does he contact the three ghosts? Is this a business that they run for a lot of different people?
But let's talk about that for a minute, because we mentioned in the beginning of the podcast that Marley was really the truer ghost, but the other three are spirits. And you even used the word shamanistic earlier in our discussion about these spirits who are more like spirit guides than they are ghosts caught in a loop, or wandering the earth, so to speak.
It's very interesting, and it's a weird way to think about the Christmas Carol, because you always think of a Christmas Carol.
It is, and some people would even throw a turkey at us for saying this, but throw your turkeys, people.
I'll eat it. Go ahead. But it's interesting because we think of this classy tale, old classic literature, dusty books, this Victorian London setting. Mm-hmm. But if you look at, what it means to be a shaman or practice shamanistic magic, it's all about interacting with spirits or spirit guides while in trances, dealing with nature, so on and so forth.
Visiting new planes of existence or dimensions.
Yeah. And some of that can be highly exaggerated in pop culture, but that's a basic understanding of it. And so now you have a guy who goes to sleep at night, almost as if he were in a sort of trance while he's asleep, and is visited by three ghosts who I would liken more to spiritual guides than ghosts, to be honest. Yeah. But it's a very interesting thought that maybe Scrooge was an accidental shaman that night. And as shamans often do, helping their community or their tribe, depending on what culture they come from, Scrooge then wakes up and goes and helps as many people as he can that day. He brings back a lot of traditions and goes and celebrates with the destitute family of Tiny Tim in order to make the most of it, and even pays for some of the medical financial problems that they were going through. And perhaps as Scrooge helped his local community, Dickens with his book helped the world at large. Again, that may be an exaggeration or not, I'm not really sure, but he certainly has impacted us quite heavily. It's interesting to note as well, as writers, you and I know how much it takes to write a book. Mm-hmm. And there are people who write at fast paces. We have NaNoWriMo, National, I don't even remember the acronym.
National Novel Writing Month in November. Mm-hmm.
Our first draft of Charlie Sullivan and the Monster Hunters Book 1 was written in 2 weeks, but we took a long time after that to whittle it down into the book it became.
And we took a long time prior to that, fleshing out characters and stories and possibilities, but once we got down to brass tacks, we literally locked ourselves in a room for 2 weeks and wrote the book.
Yeah. Dickens himself, he started writing in late October, I believe, A Christmas Carol. And it was finished product, it was published by December 19th of that year, 1843, which is amazing. And I'm jealous at the speed of that. But he put out this product that has had a lasting effect on the world. And it's interesting, it did not do very well at first.
Well, and let me stop you there for a second. Another interesting point I think you brought out to me earlier today was that a lot of the 6 weeks it took him to write the book was actually him wandering the streets of London at night, considering the state of the world.
Yeah.
It wasn't actually in writing, sitting down and writing the manuscript. It was walking around and thinking about and observing and considering what he saw around him.
And we're not talking about just a late night walk. We're talking, he walked miles. Like sometimes I think his
15, 20 miles.
Yeah, I think his biographer said he walked that 15 or 20 miles some nights. So a lot of pacing. You were talking about how he was pacing on stage. I can see him fervently walking through the streets and just thinking away.
Yeah, he was an odd creature unto himself, but completely fascinating.
So he was going through financial troubles of his own right at that point, especially considering that his 5th child was on the way. So that puts a strain on things, I know. But the story really took off as far as publication went and sales went back in that time, when he started doing public readings of the story itself. And you talked about how he was almost putting on a stage play by himself in his readings.
Yeah.
So I think people were fascinated by it. And I think, especially considering what he priced the book at, he only charged 3 shillings for the book so that anybody had an opportunity to read it. I think he left the mark he intended upon the world. And I think he got to see at least some of that.
Yeah, a lot of authors never get to see. For instance, Lovecraft. You know, he never experienced the wealth of influence that we have today from his writings. Before he passed, he never saw that.
A lot of authors and a lot of artists as well, if you think about people like Van Gogh. So it's very cool to think back and think, even though he lived a short life, that he left his mark on the world and he left his mark on all of us. And at least to some degree, he has successfully pulled off his goal with A Christmas Carol in prose, a ghost story, or being a ghost story of Christmas. So with all of the traditions that they were looking at back then, deciding whether they should keep it or not, the caroling, the wassailing, the going door to door, the gift giving, the festivities, I think a lot of that has carried over to us because of that time period when they were doing that, and probably because of this book as well. But I think we should also go back to some good old ghost stories. You know, we sing about it in that one song from Andy Williams, which you put more to Halloween. It's the most wonderful
that
time of the year.
song was written for Halloween. It's the most wonderful time. Whatever.
But there's that line in there, you know, and scary ghost stories. And back then, ghost stories during Christmas were a big deal. He wrote, I think, 2 other Christmas theme stories that were actually horror stories, or back in that day, just called ghost stories. And I think we should bring that back too.
Yeah, it'd be a good time. Folks, let me leave you with just a few quotes from Charles Dickens to close out our podcast tonight. Of course, as always, find us at themonsterguys.com. Chat with us on Twitter at themonsterguys. Here's a few quotes for you to end our chat. Have a heart that never hardens, and a temper that never tires, and a touch that never hurts. Reflect upon your present blessings, of which every man has many, not on your past misfortunes, of which all men have some. I will honor Christmas in my heart, and try to keep it all the year. And let me give you a bonus quote for all of you cat lovers out there from Charles Dickens himself. What greater gift than the love of a cat? Good night, everyone.
Good night.